It says here that our sermon today will be given by Mr. Ronald L. Come on. Playing it safe. Notice that it says here, just in case somebody else got up after this meeting. Welcome, everybody. So good to see you. We missed you last week. We were in Big Sandy. Had a wonderful Sabbath up there. Very hospitable people. They had a potluck last week. We get one this week. We'll follow the food. We'll be just fine. But it's good to be back and see all of your friendly faces again and see some strangers that are visiting. I'm glad to have you. Divorce has long been a perplexing subject. The Jews had their laws. Roman Catholics had their laws. And I suppose we have ours. This sermon is not about divorce, but about a particular Old Testament law. That is, it introduces with a particular Old Testament law regarding divorce that opens a door to understanding another very different matter. The scripture is Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. The scripture very familiar to anybody who has really seriously studied the issue of divorce and remarriage and the rights of Christians to do so. It says, when a man has taken a wife and married her, and it comes to pass that she finds no favor in his eyes because, not just for any reason, because he has found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house. Now, this is not talking about a wife who doesn't bathe often enough. It's not talking about a wife who doesn't keep the house clean. It's not talking about a wife who doesn't use deodorant. It's talking about sexual uncleanness. The Hebrew is unmistakable on this. The meaning of it seems obvious to me, but there has been an incredible range of interpretation ranging from the severe to the absurd on this particular passage. The word for uncleanness is the Hebrew word elsewhere translated nakedness. It is used as a euphemism in Leviticus 18 for a wide range of forbidden sexual activities. You can go over there, read through Leviticus 18, and you'll see if a man approach unto him that is near of kin to uncover the nakedness, it's an abomination before God. It's talking about sexual relationships with somebody you ought not to be having sex with. Now here we're talking about a man who knows his wife is fooled around before or after marriage, and he no longer wants to live with her. There are some tortuous explanations of this verse, but there really is no question about what Moses is talking about. As I said, it doesn't mean if a man finds his wife, keeps a dirty house, that he can put her out of his house and divorce her. When she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And if the latter husband hate her and write her a bill of divorcement and put it in her hand, and he sends her out of his house, which is liable to happen. People get divorced once. There was a reason for it. There's a fair to middling chance it's going to happen again, and we're assuming here it does. Okay. Then if he puts it out of her house, the former husband has sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. Right? He divorced her. She goes and lives a while with another man. He divorces her obviously for legitimate reasons, we assume, but for whatever reason, the first husband cannot take her again to be his wife. This part is explicit. After she is defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not cause the land to sin, which the Lord has given you for an inheritance. Now, this is not to say that a couple that gets a divorce cannot get married again to each other. They can. What it is saying is that they cannot and must not, if the person who has been divorced has been married to another person in between. You follow? It's fairly straightforward in that regard. Now, we kicked this around once upon a time in long and detailed and several hours long discussion among ministers about how this applied to a particular case. And we kind of came to the conclusion, well, maybe this doesn't really apply here. Subsequent events made it very clear to us that it did. No question whatsoever, and a great deal of heartache and misery, frustration would have been saved if it had been taken just like this. No, she's been in bed with another man. You divorced her for that. Don't take her back. Okay? Now, this is not to say, as I say, that divorced couples cannot remarry if they've had a divorce. Bed hopping, for one thing, is a sure way to the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases. We all know that. You keep people from sleeping around. You put one generation of having everybody sleep with one person only. All sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV, are over completely and gone. Not that that's ever going to happen, but that's still the point. Divorce is a one-way street. When it's over, it's over. Now, of special interest in this passage to me is this expression, you shall not cause the land to sin. Now, what does the land have to do with it? Well, what this means is that there is a societal interest in keeping marriage sacred. When the Bible uses the word the land in this regard, it's talking about the land of Israel. It's talking about the country. It's talking about the nation as a whole. And what he is saying is that if you don't keep marriage sacred, your society is eventually going to crumble. And indeed, in ancient Israel, it crumbled for any number of reasons. Among this is one of them. That people did start sleeping around. So society, of course, the first and foremost reason for a society regulating divorce and marriage and divorce is what? Children. Pure and simple. Society has a vested interest in protecting children because they are the future of the society. You don't protect the children, you don't deserve to survive as a society, and you won't. Pure and simple. Sexual relationships were regulated because unbridled sex can bring an entire country to the brink of ruin and beyond. Now, there is one major objection to the interpretation I'm offering you here. And it's based on Deuteronomy 22, verse 22. You don't have to look far back for it. Deuteronomy 22:22. If a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, then both of them shall die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman, so you shall put away evil from Israel. Now, I've had people come back to me with this verse and say, now see, this can't possibly be talking about a married wife who's had an affair. It can't be adultery, because if it was adultery, they were supposed to be taken out and killed. Well, now, if that's the case, then what about this thing about about divorce being permitted for the right of remarriage in a case of a matter of nakedness, which is a euphemism for sexual escapades of one kind or another? You might think at first we've got a little bit of a conflict here, but we really don't. First of all, let me say there's a great deal of information about what was done, why it was done in the Old Testament that is lost to us, and we will never be able to lay a hand on it. The assumption, though, that many make is that the law was inexorably and always applied in the letter, without fail. That does not appear to be the case for two reasons. One, there may not be the two witnesses that are required to put somebody to death. You have to understand that. It's just entirely possible. We don't have anybody who saw it. We may have had one person who saw it. It's not good enough. You have to have witnesses. The other is that there may not be anyone who wants the death penalty carried out. Now, you may think that, well, wait a minute, they're supposed to do it whether anybody wants it or not. You'd be wrong. You'd be wrong. And what is oftentimes forgotten when we go back and read Old Testament law is that it was a system of law, and that there were judges, there were priests, there were Levites who sat in judgment of cases and had to make many very difficult decisions. Law, you can't write a law that will not require interpretation and decisions and exceptions and all this kind of stuff, because human beings are more complex than that. A law big enough to cover all of it, well, it would unbalance the planet. Consider this one. Deuteronomy 22, verse 23. If a damsel that is a virgin be betrothed to a husband, and a man find her in the city and lie with them, you shall bring them both out under the gate of the city. You shall stone them with stones that they die. The damsel, because she didn't cry out, being in the city, and the man, because he has humbled his neighbor's wife. So you shall put away, notice, betrothed, she is his wife. You shall put away evil from among you. Now couple that with an episode in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise. Matthew 1, 18. When his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, exactly the situation we just heard. Before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privately. There are two important things to bear in mind about this passage. One, Joseph was not a scofflaw. He was not a man who would say, well, I know what the law is, I'm not going to do it. He was a just man. And he could have made her an example. He chose not to. And the truth is, that opening was allowed in the law. That if a man who was the offended party did not wish to make an example of his wife, did not wish to see her die under the stones of a mob, he didn't have to bring it to pass. This thus arises an insight into the law, which is kind of hard to, you might miss it easily enough, I should say. And that is that mercy was allowed. Now, I know the scripture says that he that despised Moses' law died without mercy under the hand of 2 or 3 witnesses. However, as I said, the witnesses may not be there, and also the offended party may not wish to press charges, if I may use the modern terminology for it, and oftentimes the civil authorities are helpless if the person offended does not wish to press charges. All right, mercy was allowed. Joseph would have been deemed the offended party. It was his call what to do, and no one else's. I think this is important. Now I'd like to add one more insight to this. John chapter 8, verse 1. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman taken in adultery, and they set her in the midst. And they said to him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now, the in the very act is important because you got to have witnesses. They cannot bring this woman in here to Jesus and say, well, we heard that she had committed adultery, or it was rumored that she had committed adultery, or she came out of a room with a guy and looked guilty. No, that wasn't good enough. She was actually taken in flagrante delicto, They were there. They were doing it. Now, the man was absent. Why he is missing is something many often like to ask that question, but I don't have an answer for it. In the very act is important. Witnesses were required in all capital cases. Guesswork was not permitted. Now, they asked Jesus, Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. What do you say? This they said, tempting him that they might have something to accuse him. Now make note, their motive in this case had nothing to do with justice, had nothing to do with the law, had nothing to do with preserving marriage. It had everything to do with accusing Jesus, entrapping Jesus. Jesus ignored them. He just stooped down and wrote on the ground as though he hadn't even heard them. Trying himself, basically just saying, I'm not interested in what you're doing here, and brushed it off. But they pressed, continued asking. He lifted up himself and said to them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And then he bent over again and began to write on the ground again. Now what's happening here is extremely important because the society we're dealing with is a continuation of what people like to call the Old Covenant and the law of Moses and the application of the law of Moses societally at the time. Now, while the whole crowd could participate in the stoning of an adulteress, the witnesses had to go first. The accuser had to be involved and to go first. If they were not willing to pick up the stone and throw it at her, no one else could. I think this is an important distinction to understand. As a bystander who doesn't know diddly about it and saw it happen here and says, well, I think that obviously if she was caught in the very act, we need to do it. You pick up a rock, you throw it, you're out of line and probably be punished for it. Because it had to be the witnesses, it had to be the person who was offended who were involved in this, not a third or fourth party. Okay, Jesus rolled on the ground as though he heard them not. They continued asking him. He said, He that is without sin, let him cast a stone at him. Okay, he does nothing. What came at issue here then is mercy. Sinners, if they are not in denial of their sins, can be among the most merciful of people. What Jesus did with these people who had come there was to strip away all the denial. He just stripped it away. You had to sit here and think to yourself, am I without sin? The answer, no. And once you have gotten past the denial and into the conviction of yourself as a sinner, you become much more merciful than you might have been a moment before, when your innocence was assumed, when your righteousness was assumed, when it was opposed, when it was taken for granted. But when you had to deal with the truth or falsity of your righteousness, all of a sudden you find loads of reasons to be merciful to people. It makes you wonder a little bit sometimes about some of the judges in this country who let people off for certain kinds of crimes, where we all stand around wondering, what in the world was that about? The answer may be as simple in many of these cases as the judge himself is a sinner. Maybe same sin, but no one knows it. And he just can't bring himself to put the full weight of the law on the guy. Seems to me what they ought to do in that case is they ought to recuse themselves, but that isn't the way things sometimes work. Verse 9. They who heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even to the last. That's interesting too. That the maturity of age, the long life, the self-reflection, the awareness of one's feet are made out of clay, grows on us as we get older. And it's oftentimes the young Turks among us that are the quickest and readiest to cast stones at people. But here, the oldest began to walk out, which then left the young guys standing around there with their faces hanging out, and I think ashamedly, they also left. Finally, there was nobody there but Jesus and the woman. The poor woman, standing there. Jesus looks up from writing on the ground and says, "Where are your accusers? Has no man condemned you?" And she said, "No man, Lord." And he said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Now, he could have condemned her. He had the moral authority to condemn her. He did not. Why? Mercy was allowed. Well, mercy was permitted. Now, again, you'll have to work your way through that scripture that says they died without mercy under the hand of 2 or 3 witnesses. But where are you if the accuser and the witnesses decide that they want to show mercy? Well, you're kind of stuck, aren't you? We don't have the right to stone her when the witnesses and the accuser have already left, which may well have been the case. Well, the condemnation of the poor sinner was a matter of choice. And one of the most evil approaches to the law of God is to take away the mercy option. To be sure, there are some crimes where mercy is simply not possible. Just can't be done. And those have to be dealt with. But to make the law automatic and inexorable is to make God into another kind of God entirely. And that would be my concern with mandatory sentences. I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to override judges whom they think are being too lenient. But mandatory sentences try to make the law automatic and inexorable, and I don't know that that is a good thing. The law can become as big a tyrant as any man ever was if it is not tempered by the mercy of human beings who sit in judgment of people under the law as a jury will. Many people struggle with this relative to the law. And in an attempt to kind of reconcile it, they divide the law into various compartments. You may have heard of, the ceremonial law, the moral law, the Old Covenant law, whatever particular divisions you may find the law carved up into. The whole idea is to find out, the moral law is in effect, the ceremonial and the civic law are not, and they go round and round about these things. As one friend put it, they play hopscotch through the law. There are 2 significant distinctions. There really are 2 significant divisions in what is commonly called the law of Moses. And they're not necessarily what you might think. They are commonly called moral and civil. Unfortunately, these terms carry a lot of baggage with them, and people interpret them in certain ways, so I'm going to find a different way of putting it. I call these divisions, not a very good set of terms, but they work, basic and administrative. There is in the Bible a basic law that applies to the man wherever and whenever he finds himself. Doesn't make any difference what it is. It is always there between a man and his God, and he is always being judged by it, not by man, but by God. That's the bedrock. And it includes not merely the moral law. It also includes the ceremonial law. And the reason I say this is true is because the Sabbath, the holy days, tithing, perhaps clean and unclean meats and this type of thing. Take tithing as an example. As far as I can tell in the Bible, there was no IRS in Israel. The tithe, therefore, was voluntary. It was an act of worship, and it's between a man and his God, and involved no governmental authorities whatsoever. So the tithe, then, still in effect, is and always has been an individual matter. The same thing is true of the Sabbath. Now, I do know that Nehemiah insisted on closing the businesses on the Sabbath day, but he was a civil administrator. When you move aside from civil administration, those issues are not enforceable by anyone. Okay, the obedience to this law is personal between a man and his God. God says this to Isaac, Genesis 26, verse 4. I'm going to make your seeds to multiply like the stars of heaven. I will give to your seed all these countries, and in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Why? Because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. What does that tell you? It tells you that long before Moses ever came on the scene, there was a complete, comprehensive system of law with divisions of different kinds of laws in it that are named. However, as far as we can tell, there was no central administration of that law. So the law between the man and God. You either did it or you didn't. And you got blessings or you didn't. It's just that way with God. Now, there's another law that became necessary for men to live together in a community or a society. These laws are administrative. Notice I said basic, administrative. For example, we have in this country a basic law that condemns murder. Then there's another set of laws that deal with how we deal with the murderer. The trial by jury, due process, laws of discovery, chains of evidence, all these things are matters of law, but they are matters of administrative law. How do we go about enforcing the law of murder? Now, if you move from state to state, you may find differences in the administrative law. In fact, if you move from century to century in this country, you will find differences in administrative law. For example, when I was growing up, a man could be arrested and browbeat by the police and get confession wrung out of him, and the confession go into court without the man ever having talked to a lawyer. Then along came the case involving somebody named Miranda. And the Supreme Court just, made an absolute decision that if the police do not inform a man of his rights to an attorney, any confession they get out of him prior to that is not admissible in court. So there is a completely new administrative thing, which does nothing to the underlying law against murder, does it? It hasn't mitigated murder. It hasn't made murder more acceptable. All it has to do with the way the society deals with a case of alleged murder or a guy. These laws can vary, as I said, from state to state, from century to century, and so forth. Now take this back in time to Israel in the days of the judges. We're living in the land and an adulterous relationship occurs. Okay? Barak ben Ephraim learns that his wife has been sleeping with Judah ben Manasseh down the road. Unfortunate. By law, Barak could gather the elders, establish the case, cast the first stone, and have both of them executed. That is exactly the way it would work in Israel at that time under the judges. Now, if you move these two families to Alexandria, down in Egypt, this is not at least a bit far-fetched. The Jews lived all over the place. Move these two families down to Alexandria. They are living under Egyptian law. Now, the basic law, the underlying moral law, if you will, is still very much in effect. Adultery is wrong. Barak can divorce his wife and put her away. But Egyptian administrative law may have no provision for capital punishment for adultery. May have no law against it at all. There used to be a law against committing adultery in the state of Texas. I think that has long since gone by the boards, hasn't it? We used to even have a law against sodomy, and that law got ruled unconstitutional in the Supreme Court. There may be states somewhere, I don't know, hanging on to that, but by and large, it's honored in the breach, it would seem. But you can easily see how Same people living in Egypt, Alexandria, under Egyptian law, would have the same moral problem, but they would not have the same administrative problem. As simple as that. And it underlines, I think, a major source of misunderstanding that we have in the law and the way it's applied. Now, Jesus did say, you're all familiar with this from Matthew 5:17, think not that I am come to destroy the law of the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot or one tittle shall in any wise pass in the law, till everything is accomplished. And the choice of the words, jot or tittle, makes it clear that what Jesus is talking about is the written law as opposed to the oral law, which the Pharisees held to be binding as much as the written law. Jesus is about to send a torpedo amidships into the oral law. But he wants to establish, first of all, he's not chipping away at the written law in any form. Now, this would include, though, when you think about this, all the administrative law in the Old Testament, which is also written, as well as the moral law. What do we do about that? Well, the administrative law may not be enforceable if there is no administration authorized to administer it. Just can't do it. It's not that it's still there. It's not that it's in place, but there is no one authorized to do it. It's much like the sacrificial law regarding animal sacrifices. It's not that they have been abolished, but there is neither the place nor the personnel authorized where this can be done. Not that the law has been abolished, only that there is no one to do it, nor a place to do it. The law remains. But it can only serve as a precedent to show the will of God at a given time and place. A man or woman may commit adultery and escape the death penalty because there is no administrative procedure for dealing with that. But the law remains to teach man and woman how truly damaging adultery is to human relationships, to society, to children. It is so serious that at one point in time and place, in a society, a community where people were still very close to each other, it was punished by death to impress upon everyone's mind. And so, we look at this today, not dismissing that law, accepting the fact that there is no administration, no civil administration to carry it out. We still read it and we say to ourselves, wow, that's what God thinks about people who do this. In that way, a man, it suggests also a call for forgiveness and for mercy, and reveals why the call for mercy is needed. It actually creates a situation where a person can fall on his knees before God and say, I have sinned, I am worthy of death, forgive me. And the mercy may be forthcoming. Okay, now what I've said so far, this is the sum. Old Testament law is not nearly as absolute as many people seem to think. There were judges, there were priests, there were elders, there was an entire administration that had to deal with it. Some penalties were at the discretion of these people, and there could be extenuating circumstances, and they were allowed to take them into consideration. It could happen. Someone pointed to the example of David and Bathsheba and wondered why they should not have been executed for their crime. Now, one obvious reason, and this only really occurred to me recently when somebody asked the question, and I sat back and put my feet up and thought for a minute about, well, why wasn't David executed as a result of this? The answer is, David was the head of state. Who else? Who's going to execute him? Who's going to carry out this penalty? Who's going to actually do the deed to David? You can't do it. That's why the responsibility on the head of state is as heavy as it is. There was no one above the king who would sit in judgment of him and call for his execution. Now, I do recognize God could have killed David, but he had before this delegated judgment to a civil administration, and he was not willing or prepared to take it back at this point, which he would have had to do. He would have had to cut across what he had done, had to have pulled all that back with all of the turmoil that would have created, and the answer was, I am not going to do it. I think there's something very important in that simple fact. Even when civil government is corrupt, it still has the authority delegated by God to judge. Did you get that? Even when civil government is corrupt, it still has the God-given authority to judge. So that David, even though he was corrupted in this particular instance, was still the king. And all the authority of God was invested in the king. Now, Romans 13, verse 1 comes into play at this point. The familiar scripture, again, to anyone who studied along these lines. Paul said, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. There is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God." Who were these authorities when Paul wrote these words? Roman emperor, Roman Senate, the Roman Empire, pagan to the core. And yet they were the civil authority under which these people lived. Just like Egypt was the civil authority under which Barak and his wife lived back in my example that I made up. So it goes all through this. There is a civil authority that we live under, and we are bound by the laws and the administration of that civil authority. Whoever therefore resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment upon themselves. Is it okay for you to exceed the speed limit then, since the government is government of God? Oh yeah, you can exceed it, but you'll pay. You'll be subject to whatever penalty they lay on you, and Jesus is not going to get you out. There's no point when you've been speeding and you get a ticket to pray and ask Jesus to give you grace in the eyes of the judge. He's already told you he's not going to do that. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what's good. You'll have praise from the authority. For he is God's minister to you for good. Now, there's an interesting thing, and I didn't look this up, but I'm just as sure as I can be that the word translated minister here is the Greek word diakonos, from which we derive the word deacon, which basically means he's a servant, in this case, a civil servant. The public servants that are out here. He is God's servant to you for good. Do what's good, you'll have praise of the same. If you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is God's deacon, Avenger to execute wrath upon him who practices evil. Therefore be subject, not only because of wrath, but for conscience sake. Now, we've got two things going here. Very important thing he said on the end. One is, you'd better be subject because of the authority of the government and what they can do to you. But you also need to be subject because of your conscience. In other words, the moral law, what is right, the way to treat people. All this is just as true whether the government knows about it or cares about it or not. This much we need to understand. I think it's very important. Now, this raises another interesting discussion. As I said, it's not unlike our two Israelites living in Alexandria. Adultery was still against God and your neighbor. It's just that the Egyptian law controlled matters of execution. They couldn't do there what they might have done at home. Now, who in Mosaic law, this is an interesting item, who in Mosaic law was the avenger? For Paul says the government is the avenger of God in situations like this. Under Mosaic law, in the time of the monarchy, the state was the avenger. David and his administration were God's diaconate as well. They were the ones who administered the death penalty. In the time of Samuel, though, actually from Joshua to Samuel, it was different. If you'll turn back to Numbers chapter 35, I'll point out what I'm talking about. In Numbers chapter 35, verse 9, the Lord spoke to Moses, said this, "Speak to the children of Israel and tell them this. When you come over Jordan into the land of Canaan, you are to appoint you cities to be cities of refuge for you, so that the slayer may flee there who kills any person unintentionally." In other words, you make a mistake, you kill somebody by accident, you have to get yourself up and you have to get straight to the city of refuge fast. They shall be cities for refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer die not until he stands before the congregation in judgment. In other words, he's got to have due process. He doesn't have due process between the place that he hid the deed and the city of refuge, and so he needs to not waste any time getting from here to there. And of these cities you shall have 6 of them. Now, this is an early example of due process. Intentional murder was one thing. Manslaughter was something else entirely. But what is of special interest to me in this passage is the word Avenger. Now, I don't know how I got this old without noticing this, but I didn't. And so today is the first time I think I'll have a chance to talk about it. In Hebrew, the word translated Avenger means Redeemer, which is kind of odd, isn't it? It means Redeemer. But when you understand what that means, it gets a little broader. For example, Job 19, verse 25, I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand in the latter day upon the earth. Same word. Same word exactly. So, look again at verse 12. They shall be unto you cities of refuge from the Redeemer, that the manslayer die not until he stands before the congregation in judgment. The Redeemer, as this word, I don't know how to pronounce Hebrew words, and so I won't even try. The Redeemer, in this case, is a synonym for the next of kin, who has the right to redeem his brother from slavery, or in this case, to redeem his blood from the man who took it. In other words, if you got real stupid or greedy in ancient Israel, you stole some stuff and sold it off, spent the money, and they caught you. Okay? You can't make repayment. What they did was they put you up on the auction block and sold you off as a slave for 7 years. That's just the way it worked. Well, your brother, your next of kin, your redeemer, had the right under Israelite law to come in, pay the price that went across the auction block for you, and to buy you back, to redeem you from servitude. The person who bought you at auction had no right to decline the sale. To the redeemer, he had to let you go. To anybody else, he'd have to say, no, I got to have double my money or you can't have this guy. But to the redeemer, he had to let him go for the normal price. Okay, this is basically what it means, and is that nearest of kin who has the responsibility for this. Now, it's interesting to me in revealing of what lies behind the death penalty under Moses' law, because this is something that's really not very well understood at all. I read an interesting piece recently that drew a distinction between vengeance and retribution. Vengeance being the thing we want to do in the heat of passion. We want to revenge the death of our brother or our sister or whoever it is on this guy, and we, in our rage and our passion, go out and kill the guy. That's vengeance. Retribution is something else entirely. Retribution is a restoring of balance. It is a matter of putting things back in perspective. It's a matter of paying of a debt that was due. And in Paul, in Romans, when he uses the term avenger, good Hebrew that he was using it in the sense it's used in the Old Testament, of balancing the books. Blood has been shed. According to Genesis, by man shall his blood be shed. In Rome, the state was the avenger of blood, and there were no cities of refuge. But in the time of Judges, it was different. Deuteronomy chapter 19 also talks about this. When the Lord your God has cut off the nations whose land the Lord has given you, and you succeed them and dwell in their cities and their houses, you shall separate 3 cities for you in the midst of your land, which the Lord your God gives to possess it. The difference between this 3 and this here and the 6 elsewhere is another subject. You shall prepare a way, divide the coast of your land which the Lord has given you, so that every slayer may get to one of these by the shortest route possible, is what he's trying to say. This is the case of the slayer that shall flee there, that he may live. Whoever kills his neighbor ignorantly, whom he had not hated in time past. Motive is part of the equation, which I think is fascinating. Nowadays, one of the juries want to know about what is motive. They look for 3 things. Motive, means, opportunity. Okay? Here is motive. Whoever kills his brother, whom he hated not in time past, as when a man goes into the wood with his neighbor to cut wood, his hand fetches a stroke with the axe to cut down the tree, and the head slips from the haft and lights upon his neighbor and kills him. He can flee to one of these cities and live, at least until the judges get a chance to evaluate his case. You know, that's very real to me, because I can recall in the past cutting wood and having that axe head come off in the course of a good swing. And it's kind of a funny feeling when that takes place. And you realize somebody could have been where that thing came off. It doesn't impress upon your mind the importance of being careful. Anyway, he goes and lives, lest the redeemer of the blood pursue the slayer while his heart is hot, which is vengeance, overtake him, because the way is long and slay him. Because whereas he was not worthy of death, inasmuch as he had not hated the guy in years gone by. What's interesting is the person with the legal right to redeem could take the life of the killer without penalty to himself. It was allowed. It really is not vengeance, it's retribution, the balancing of the books, and you had to have the legal right of next of kin to execute this. Going on to verse 11. But if any man hate his neighbor, and lie in wait for him, and rise up against him, and smite him mortally that he die, and he flees to one of these cities of refuge, then the elders of his city shall send and fetch him back, deliver him into the hand of the Redeemer of blood, that he may die. This sounds to me like he turns him over to the nearest of kin, and it is the nearest of kin's discretion to kill the man. He's the executioner, not some stranger that had nothing whatever to do with it. It's really fascinating to consider some of the social implications of these laws and of what they meant. And it's very possible in some cases that the next of kin might not have liked his brother very much and might not have pursued very fast after the guy who did away with it. I really don't know how that would have worked. But this is what was done. Now it also says in Numbers 35 and verse 30, whoever kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses. But one witness is not sufficient testimony against a person for the death penalty. That's important. You can't just on the say-so of one person, he says, she says, won't wash it in Hebrew law. If that's what you've got, you might as well not come to court. You've got to have witnesses. Now, some people have often asked about this in relation to modern testimony, but if a fingerprint is taken from the scene of a crime, and a fingerprint expert is on the stand to identify the fingerprint, he counts as a witness. He didn't witness the crime. He counts as a witness of the fact that you were there. Opportunity, which is one of the three pillars of deciding whether or not somebody might have killed someone. But that's another matter. Moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death. He shall be put to death. Nobody's going to come. Nobody can ransom him. Nobody can pay him off. No fine is big enough. You shall take no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the priest. You shall not pollute the land where you live, for blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him that shed it. Now this is really interesting. The implications of this very far-reaching. What he's saying is this: violent crime in your land will pollute the land, and there is no atonement for it except the blood of the slayer of men. That's all. It's the only way it can be done. In Genesis it says this: whosoever sheds man blood, by man shall his blood be shed. It is the fundamental law long before Moses and was required. How in the world anyone appeals to the Bible to say the death penalty is wrong is beyond my reach. But people do. Now, one witness was not enough. Now, I think there's an interesting aspect of this. I think judicial execution was probably infrequent in those days. I doubt very seriously if they had to kill somebody for murder very often. Did they allow circumstantial evidence into court? Probably not to the extent that courts do today. For one thing, we have more technology than they did there, but I have an idea. The whole idea of witnesses was very strong. Now, you could have brought a witness into court to say, oh yeah, I know he hated this guy. He has hated him for years. He talks about him every time we get together. He wanted to kill him. That man could come into court and testify. It's doubtful, frankly, that O.J. Simpson would have been convicted under the law of Moses. Might have been, but doubtful. It's doubtful that Scott Peterson would have been convicted under the law of Moses because of insufficient witnesses. Circumstantial evidence of the nature that finally convicted these guys may not have been allowed. Our Constitution says that no man should be deprived of life or liberty without due process of law. Same thing was true in the Bible. I worry a little bit about our system these days. I think the office of the prosecutor is the weak link. And some of the things that our prosecutors are doing these days are highly politically motivated. And you'd really, the old saying, a good prosecuting attorney can indict a ham sandwich. So the fact that someone is indicted doesn't mean a blessed thing. It's funny how people you interview jury members, most people I think who wind up coming down to serve on a jury will, if you ask them before anybody told them any better, well, do you think the fact that he was indicted indicates that he's guilty? Most of them will say, yeah, I think it probably does. No, it doesn't. That's why we have the jury trial. You have the grand jury, you have a petit jury. Petit jury is the ordinary jury that many of you probably have been called on to serve from time to time. And just because the grand jury does indict a person, we don't stop there. We take it to 12 people, in a case of life or liberty, of the man's peers who get to sit there and listen to the evidence and see what he says. Now, one of the things that would cure a lot of abuses, I think, in our society is if this law out of Deuteronomy 19 were followed. Deuteronomy 19, verse 16. If a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, which has certain implications regarding those witnesses that claim that Jesus, were false witnesses against Jesus, but that's another matter. Then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness be a false witness, have testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he had thought to have done to his brother, so you will put away evil from the midst of you. You sit up there and you're going to lie about this matter. You're going to claim you saw something you didn't see because you're trying to put this man in jail. They find out you're going to jail. Not merely with perjury. You're going to jail with the penalty that man would have had. If it's 15 years, 25 years, or life, that's what's coming to you if you're a false witness against a person in a court under God's law. He said basically, if you do this to him, you will put away evil from among you. And I would think so. I would think that would have a profound effect. I would say we probably would have an awful lot of guilty people go free. Frankly, I may be wrong about this, but this is how I feel. I would rather see 10 guilty men go free than one guilty man go to prison. One innocent man go to prison. It's just the way I feel. As I once said, I'm not willing to spend one day in jail to make it easier for a prosecutor to convict guilty people. That's not the way our system is supposed to work. Now, as a fact that authorities have on occasion cooked the evidence to get a man they were sure was guilty. They knew they had him, they were certain of his guilt, and they actually cooked the evidence because without doing it, they would never get a conviction in a court of law. If that could ever be proved, they should go to jail for at least as long as the guy they were trying to convict had to go. Now, the thing about this is, that will mean that all this kind of stuff will stop. There will not be people who are planting evidence. There will not be police officers that are throwing a gun down on the ground so they can pretend that the guy had a gun when they shot him dead. There won't be any of that, because if it can be proved that they cooked the books against this person or that person, they're going to jail for a very long time, and of course might even forfeit their life. If it's proved that then the DA or the officers guilty of that should go to jail for the same term they're going to try to put on this criminal, we would put a lot of bad stuff away in law enforcement in this land. Now I'll say this to all of you. If you're ever called to serve on a grand jury or a petit jury, hold the prosecutor's feet to the fire and be sure that he has proved his case beyond a reasonable doubt. Don't play games, not with somebody's life or somebody's liberty. Because if you are sitting in that room judging, you are like one of the elders of Israel under Joshua, called upon to judge a case like this, and God will hold your feet to the fire if you play games and are not strict in your judgment of people and strict in your standards of required proof. Important, I think. I think Scott Peterson may well have killed his wife and unborn child, but he should not be convicted because he is a proven louse. He should not be convicted because the prosecutor has made people hate him, or the jury has come to conclude that he is a hateful person. He may be, but that's not the point. The question is, has the evidence come through this courtroom to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Scott Peter murdered Lacey Peterson and his unborn son, wasn't it, that she had? Let me take my summary then a little bit further. There is much about the Old Testament that we do not understand. We know from Jesus that not one word of it has been abolished. We know that we have to draw a line at the point of the administration of the law. That we know. Now I want to get a little closer to the original language of something that Paul wrote that applies to this, and it's in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Paul said, "Such trust we have through Christ toward God, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything of ourselves. Our sufficiency is of God, who has made us able deacons of the New Testament," the New Covenant. That's the word in Greek, diakonos, or deacon. And basically the word means an administrator. We have that administration. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. The letter kills. The Spirit gives life. But if the diaconate of death, that is the administration of death, written and engraven in stones was glorious, so the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, with which glory of Moses' face was to be done away, how shall not the diaconate of the Spirit be rather glorious? For if the diaconate of condemnation be glory, much more does the diaconate of righteousness exceed in glory. What's Paul talking about? He is saying we have now a different administration of the same law. That's his point. We are no longer, lumbering along under the administration of the scribes and Pharisees. It is now the apostles who carry the administration of the new covenant in Jesus Christ. And all this stuff is truly important. There's more in that particular passage. I'll let you read it for yourself later. I think what is too often overlooked in Paul's writing is his rejection of the diaconate of the Jewish establishment. Their administration was corrupt. Moses was glorious, and Moses was adequate for the governance of a nation if it was maintained strictly. But he was inadequate for the heart of a man. Moses' administration was inadequate for the heart of a man. It was only adequate for holding a nation and a people together. I think this is really an important idea that's going to need a lot more attention. Paul concludes by saying, "But we all with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord." For most of us these days, the administration of the law of God is a very personal thing. There is nobody standing outside of us, nobody standing apart from us who can tell us how to worship God, when to worship God, where to worship God. And therefore the obligations and responsibilities that fall on our shoulders perhaps rest more heavily. God give us the grace, the insight to live by it.